Hey everybody, John Jackson here, also known as Attorney Somm. I'm known as Attorney Somm because while I practice law, I also pursue my passion for wine whenever I'm not working as an attorney. There you are. Hi Meredith, how are you?
Hi, good. How are you, John?
Excellent. So I was just telling everyone that we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of Dom Perignon, and then we're going to be getting into their winemaking philosophy, a little bit about the signature style, including some information about the plenitudes, like the P2 and the P3s. I know people have a lot of questions about that. Then we're going to be doing a virtual tasting of 3 outstanding champagnes, including the 2010 vintage, the 2002 P2, and then the 2006 Rosé. So we have a lot to cover today. Thanks so much for joining us. Certainly Dom Perignon is a very iconic brand, and everyone's very excited to hear from you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. Very excited to talk about Dom Perignon. It's a super exciting champagne. Dom Perignon is arguably, one of the more famous wines in the world. The name, the bottle is instantly recognizable around the world. If you're watching a movie and you see that dark bottle with just like a semblance of that green shield, you know exactly what it is. Not only is it an icon in the world of wine, but it's also a universal symbol of luxury. You can refer to something else as the Dom Perignon of blank. It's just fascinating how iconic this wine is. And at the same time, what's so amazing about it is the fact that they are still killing it. Dom Perignon has earned this reputation through centuries of upholding the highest standards of quality. These wines are just so monumentally profound, and they continue to be. It's amazing. Dom Perignon owns the category. They continue to own the category of champagne. And there's really just nothing else quite like it. It's a real pleasure. And you don't really see that a lot in consumer goods. This iconic status comes from the rich heritage, with Dom Perignon being considered the spiritual father of winemaking in Champagne, and how we preserve that legacy today as well, just continuing to set the standard for prestige champagne.
Certainly, and there's always some excitement in the room whenever someone opens a bottle of Dom. So there's always a little bit extra intensity and excitement whenever someone opens it.
Absolutely.
Maybe we could start out by talking about the history of Dom Perignon and how it started.
Absolutely. The Champagne region, before being known for the sparkling wine that it is today, does have a history of winemaking pre-medieval times. The Romans were the ones who planted vineyards in this northeastern area of France in about the 4th or 5th century. Monasteries were actually in charge of cultivating the vineyards and making wine for use in the sacrament of the Eucharist in the church. French kings were later traditionally anointed in the city of Reims, and the wines of the region were served at the coronation. So in 1668, Dom Perignon became a cellarer at the Abbey of Auvilliers. His name, Dom, meaning Dominus, the prefix of his name, Dominus, because he was a Benedictine monk. And then his name was Pierre Perignon. The abbey was founded in 650 by the Bishop of Reims. Really later on, by the mid-17th century, when Dom Perignon came around, the abbey was suffering a lot. It was deeply in debt, and it's important to remember and note Champagne and the region really sits at a crossroads in Europe, for better or for worse. This is great for trade reasons, but really devastating when you consider the amount of just war and turmoil that has ensued over the course of history through this part of the world. So this region has endured terrible destruction over the centuries, and the Abbey of Auvilliers specifically suffered over the centuries due to invasions and religious wars. Dom Perignon, when he became cellarer, he was responsible for wine production specifically, but also just ensuring the prosperity of the abbey. Really, wine was considered a gift of God and a gift of nature. So he set out to make the best wine in the world for God, for the church, and the abbey to regain the cultural and spiritual prosperity that it once enjoyed. So in his tenure of about 47 years at the abbey, he was on a quest for perfection. He essentially on this quest, this led him to developing a lot of revolutionary techniques for viticulture, and also for winemaking that just remain the standard for all of Champagne today. He conducted a lot of patient experiments, made many careful observations along the process that really just allowed him to gain a lot of advanced knowledge of cultivating vines and making wine. He had exceptional talents not only as a winemaker, but also just as a manager of the abbey. Another thing that's important to note too, that was interesting about this time is that Champagne for centuries really just wanted to make something, produce something as good as their neighbors to the south in Burgundy, but our climate in Champagne being as cold as it is, still red wines just really wouldn't possess the power that they did in Burgundy. Not to mention we had this persistent problem of bottle re-fermentation, in-bottle re-fermentation, which we'll get into a little bit more later. Dom Perignon really just harnessed the true character of the Champagne terroir, amplified it in a way that just had never been seen before. The principles that guided winemaking at this time as well were rather haphazard. For instance, fermentation had not even been scientifically explained until later in the 1800s by Louis Pasteur. Dom Perignon was experimenting with fermentation almost a century before that. When he was hired as cellarer, one of his first jobs was figuring out why the wine kept bubbling. In France, the first sparkling wines were created accidentally. There was no invention of it. Bubbles in wine were considered a fault, really. It's a naturally occurring phenomenon. Anytime there's residual yeast left in a wine and temperatures are fluctuating, any residual sugar will be consumed by the yeast. Fermentation ensues, which is what creates that CO2 or the bubbles. It's led to it being called the devil's wine because the pressure inside the bottles would cause them to explode, and spontaneously bursting bottles would cause a chain reaction in cellars, and multiple bottles would explode, corks would fly out, just mass chaos. And you can imagine anything that you couldn't explain had something to do with the devil at that time. So champagne being as cold as it was, when the weather cooled, the yeast would go dormant, and then fermentation would be halted before all the fermentable sugars had been consumed and converted to alcohol. And then when they'd reactivate, as temperatures rose again, the bottles would explode. So these were really just mysterious circumstances surrounding a then unknown process. So Dom Perignon spent a lot of his life and his tenure working at the Abbey, trying to figure out this process, trying to control it, improving the quality of the wine coming from Champagne. So when everything was guided by these empirical methods, Dom Perignon, a perfectionist, developed really precise rules and techniques for viticulture and winemaking based on these rules that ultimately just improved the quality of wines from Champagne. The first of these being just the careful handling of grapes and the selection of grapes from vines. So he improved the way that the soil was fertilized in Champagne. He detailed how to prune vines to optimize vine growth, how to select individual grapes from vines. And then also he was an advocate for harvesting at maturity before sunrise, and then pressing as soon as possible to minimize the amount of damage to the grapes in transport. Secondly, he was the founding father of assemblage, or blending. The art of blending grapes coming from different crus or villages is central to Dom Perignon still to this day. He was also the first to combine different grape varietals from distinctly different terroirs to achieve this kind of harmonious balance of all of their characteristics. This quest for harmony is something that is still central to our core beliefs at Dom Perignon. He designed the technique of fractional pressing as well. This is a slow, gentle, incremental process that allows the extraction of white juice from red grapes. So if you think about a red grape, it's really just the skin itself that's red. If you bite into it or cut into it, the inside juice and pulp is white. The color of wine comes only from the skins, and gentle pressing allows that white juice on the inside to just burst out without major disturbance of the skins and any contact with the pigment. He really was a visionary. The work that he did in his lifetime really serves as creative inspiration for us to this day.
And you still have the statue out front to remember him and his contributions. Certainly very important contributions, especially the blending process and the extraction of white from the black grapes. Very, very important steps along the way.
Absolutely.
Maybe we could shift gears a little bit and then talk about the winemaking philosophy for Dom Perignon. How do they approach winemaking today?
Winemaking still captures a little bit of those surprises that are brought by nature, but requires some repetition, but also innovation. And blending is still incredibly important at Dom Perignon. It's the sum of all of its terroirs. We have state plots in 8 Grand Cru villages and 1 Premier Cru, and then also unique partnership and access to all 17 Grand Cru in Champagne. The 1 Premier Cru is that of Auvillé, which is the historic plot where Dom Perignon worked during his lifetime. We call it the Clos Sacré. Clos Sacré. It's the sacred plot. It sits against the Montagne de Reims at about 190 meters in elevation, and it really just overlooks the entire Marne Valley, and it's quite beautiful. It has a slightly higher acidity, which is unique because it kind of gives a distinct expression to the wine. We use about 5% of the wine in the blend from this Premier Cru. The blend of Dom Perignon is always a near 50-50 split between Chardonnay and Pinot Noir because we really want to play with opposing elements in the wine. Without a diversity of grapes coming from different crus, there would be no contrast. We want to balance one element with another in order to create a better whole. essentially. And we might change the specific sources of the grapes. In that 50-50 splits, we might change where our Chardonnays are coming from, and we might change where our Pinot Noirs are coming from. But for the most part, it's always going to be 50% Pinot Noir and 50% Chardonnay. Sometimes, depending on the year, we might up the percentage of one or the other, depending on the health. Another thing that we do, we practice minimalist vinification. So minimal intervention. We really just want to let the grapes do the talking, let the inherent qualities of the grapes shine. And when you do this, you really just need healthy grapes, since there's not a lot of intervention and manipulation to hide behind. We limit exposure to oxygen throughout the entire process as well. So no oak, only stainless steel. We really just want to preserve the natural freshness of the fruit and the purity of the fruit. It's a combination of the terroir that I mentioned and also this reductive winemaking style that really just enhances that unique mineral characteristic of Dom Perignon that's just so unique to Dom Perignon.
And so no Meunier at all. It's all Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
Exactly, yes.
Great. Well, we've had a lot of questions about the plenitudes and what does P2 mean? What does P3? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the plenitude system and the signature style of Dom Perignon.
Absolutely. So we talked about the philosophy behind winemaking, which kind of allows us to get into the evolution of the wine, which is our signature, the three windows of expression known as the plenitudes. So the word plenitude means a state of fullness or completion, so to speak. The wine over time goes through this subtle metamorphosis and reaches these three distinct windows of expression. You may have noticed a cuvée of Dom Perignon in the market with a P2 or P3. You're incredibly lucky you've seen the P3. They're really rare, but incredibly special wines. Whereas the flagship of Dom Perignon vintage is what we can refer to technically as P1. Every Dom Perignon vintage must have the potential to reach the three plenitudes. And there's a portion of every harvest that we hold back and age for longer on the lees in the cellars at Dom Perignon. Once the first plenitude is reached, so P1 or Dom Perignon vintage, after an average of 8 to 10 years, release Dom Perignon vintage. The second plenitude or window is P2. And that takes an average of about 16 years, 15 in the case of the vintage 2002 P2. And then the third window is P3. This comes after about a minimum of 20 years of extended aging on the lees. We also do a minimum of 1 year bottle aging post-disgorgement at Dom Perignon. And we're really just striving for harmony at every stage. And that's what we see at these three successive windows or leaps that we call the plenitude. Distinct state of harmony. The wine is just at this peak of expression at these moments. So that's what we like to express with the plenitudes. It must be refined as well. There's a core of just intensity, precision, that minerality that I was talking about, and that salinity that I absolutely love. It's kind of part of the minerality. There's this great kind of like oyster shell, granite, sea air quality that's just magnificent. And then it's followed by these really cool kind of peaty, smoky, earthy facets. It's really unique. And then, of course, the texture of the wine, it's really quite fine grained, silky, almost creamy on your palate. There's a rather tactile mouthfeel. It's the epitome of tiny bubbles. It's really on the palate where things just go, wow. This creamy, silky, elegant texture, not like soda water carbonation where it's really fast-moving bubbles, aggressive. It's very minute, delicate, silky, creamy, and really time is the only thing that can allow the bubbles to reduce to this size. The effervescence just becomes fully integrated into the wine and gives it that silky texture. And then, of course, complexity. This comes from the diversity of the origins of the grapes, precision in their blending, really just extended time maturation. The complexity is kind of the sum of all of these expressions. It's the harmony among all of these qualities and sensations deliver the full experience of Dom Perignon.
And certainly when we talk about some other vintage champagnes, they're oftentimes released when they're ready to drink. And certainly vintage Dom Perignon is ready to drink on release. But it's also capable of bottle aging for an extended period of time as well. And so people have the opportunity to buy the P2 and the P3 when they come out. And if they drank all their P1s on release and don't have any more left, they get another chance at it. But they could also buy the P1s and age them. Certainly that's something I've been doing for a while, and they age incredibly well in the bottle as well.
Absolutely.
So you could get the same experience if you just load up on the P1s each year and then try not to drink all of them and make sure you can save some.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, maybe we can shift gears a little bit and talk about the focus on a vintage. How long has Dom Perignon been focusing on vintages? when did they first start producing vintage champagne?
So yeah, something that's incredibly unique about Dom Perignon is that it's always a vintage. It can only be produced from the harvest of a single year. It's never a non-vintage blend. All creative processes have their constraints, and Dom Perignon's is the vintage. Our first vintage was in 1921. Every vintage embodies the signature of Dom Perignon, while also just expressing the singularity of the year and finding a balance between the two. You want to express the nuances of the terroir with respect to the seasonal conditions. Given the demanding and unpredictable climate in Champagne, it can be a rather risky proposition. It demands versatility and innovation. You really, no matter what, want to achieve that level of quality and distinctive character, even if that means not declaring a vintage, which happens sometimes. But what I find so interesting too about this commitment to vintage only is the fact that when it comes to declaring a vintage, it's really not just a matter of, will this make a good champagne in 8 or so years, but rather, would this make a good P3? Every single time we declare a vintage, the vintage must have the potential to be long-lived and transform over time into this masterfully complex and harmonious champagne. So it doesn't end with the declaration of a vintage. The wine has to have the ability to elevate to a second life, so to speak, through time and aging. So Dom Perignon declares an average of about 7 vintages per decade. We've declared 44 vintages to date, the first being in 1921, I believe I mentioned, 26 for Rosé, the first in 1959. And this vintage-only philosophy has really elevated Dom Perignon into the realm of great Burgundies of the world. Like you mentioned, you can collect it, you can further bottle age it in your own cellars. Vintage only is a risky proposition, but something really special in terms of how we stand out.
Before we get into the tasting, I think we're going to be doing the 2010 vintage, which is this is the current release. Actually, the 2009 was released a little bit out of order. It was released before the 2008. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So basically, we have to wait for the wine to be ready. And in the case of 2008 and 2009 was a little bit more of a riper vintage. So the fruit was expressing itself differently, sooner. So, and the wine is king, and nature is king when it comes to these things. So we ended up releasing 2009 before 2008 simply because it was ready sooner, and 2008 needed a little bit more time.
And usually I like to age my Dom that I buy on release, but the 2009 I think is an exception. That's one that I've been enjoying very young. And we've been referring to that as Dom in a bikini because it's so tropical and ripe and fruit forward. So it's a little bit unusual, but that's a fun one to drink early.
Totally.
Before we get into the tasting of the 2010 vintage, maybe you could talk a little bit about the label in the bottle.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's pretty unique in shape and design. We were talking about before, just the shape is pretty iconic, and it is unique. It has a little bit more of a squatty shape to it, which is, and the dark glass as well, is really an homage to the bottles used in the 17th century. And then the shield has the handwritten writing, which is also an homage to the monks at the Abbey of Auvilliers. And then as well, Altum Villare, which is Latin for high village. That's referring to the Abbey of Auvilliers as well. With regard to opening a bottle of Dom Perignon, our packaging is a little bit unique when it comes to the foil. We use antique foil. It's much thinner and adheres to the bottle. It's not intended to be removed like other foils that there's a little perforation that you tear off. So if you attempt to pull at it and you pull it off like that, it's just going to crumble in your hands. So really what you want to do, and all you have to do, is just through the foil, find the little pull tab here. You can see it pretty easily on this rosé. So you just find it and then pluck it out just directly through the foil. And then from there, you just twist it 6 times and then you can remove from there. So no need to remove the foil on a bottle of Dom Perignon.
And we've had a comment about the enotec program. Perhaps you can comment on how the enotec wines correspond to the P2 and the P3s.
Essentially, yeah, it's the same program. Plenitude, we just essentially kind of changed how we referred to the program because we felt that the Plenitude just better expressed our objective with this program. So, and just kind of helped consumers understand really what we were going for here, why we held the wines back and aged them a little bit longer. Also, separating, P1, P2, P3, really, I think just better expressed what we were doing. So it's the same idea. The enotec wines as well are just vintages that were held back for a little bit longer at Dom Perignon, simply just a name change with the program.
Okay, perfect. Well, maybe now we can get into the tasting finally. The 2010 vintage is up first. And before we get into the tasting, what can you tell us about the vintage? I know it's a bit surprising to me that they came out with a vintage in 2010, since a lot of the producers like Cristal, for example, jumped ahead to 2012 already.
Yeah, definitely. Hunting challenge. Not a lot of houses did it. There was a really icy cold winter. The summer was pretty hot, but not excessively hot. And then I think about mid-August, 2 days of heavy rain fell. This kind of brought that ideal dry summer trajectory to a halt. In just a few days after that heavy rainfall, botrytis developed on a lot of the Pinot Noir. The grapes weren't fully mature at this point, so they couldn't harvest early to prevent further rot from happening. So at Dom Perignon, we decided to abandon about 15% of the Pinot Noir. They were really just hit the hardest, those grapes. And so from there, they really just wanted to focus on the ripe, healthy grapes elsewhere. So they lost a large portion of the harvest. However, Pinot Noir that was saved proved to be quite healthy and expressive. Anyone else who potentially declared a vintage in 2010, I've seen a few growers, but other than that, there were very few. Chardonnay is kind of a hallmark of that vintage because those grapes ended up being very mature, but Pinot Noir did suffer that year. So it was an interesting vintage. After spending about 8 years on the lees, the 2010 vintage reached its first peak of expression, harmony, in what we can consider the first plenitude. So this is Dom Perignon vintage 2010. So again, just going for that ideal balance. So the time may vary 1 to 2 years, like we were talking about with the 2009 and the 2008. Yeah, so the taste profile on this one, like you mentioned, really tropical. There's great, pineapple, orange zest, and then again, that really characteristic minerality on the nose. I heard someone once refer to this, the nose, as being like flowers after a rainfall, which I loved because there's a great freshness to that. And then that kind of continues on the palate too, with a little bit more of those floral notes and the jasmine, things of that sort.
There's a little bit of dried ginger and some spiciness too, like a little bit of maybe white pepper. But yeah, definitely some tropical fruit, but it's a little bit different than the 09 profile. And also the acidity, I think, is much more prominent than for the 2009, certainly.
Yeah, and that it's really rich and full, that nice, delicate, tactile sensation on your palate, with an incredibly long finish as well. That vibrant salinity, which is just so characteristic of Dom Perignon, just really lingers on the finish.
Yeah, for me, it's almost kind of like an intermediate wine between the 09 and the 2008, kind of in between there, with a little bit of the tropical fruit from the 09, but more of the acidity like the 08.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree.
So should we move on to the P2, which of course is from the legendary 2002 vintage, not that old a vintage. It's certainly one of the better vintages that we've had in Champagne, along with 1996 and some of the others for the past 25, 30 years. So this is definitely an iconic wine, and one that will be able to be aged for a very, very long time.
So this one's really exciting for a lot of reasons. Like you mentioned, the 2002 vintage, and also this is Plenitude 2. This is the second life of Dom Perignon. So for each vintage from its inception, a limited number of bottles are held back that are just predestined from the beginning for longer aging. These are sealed with a cork and staple as opposed to a crown cap, which is typical in Champagne. And at that point, all of the leaves inside the bottle collect behind the cork and basically act as a second barrier against oxygen. So really just slows down the maturation even further, preventing more oxygen from getting into the bottle, and really just lets time work its magic. This extended maturation on the lees as well really just allows the blend's opposite and complementary elements resonate with one another. And that's what we find in P2. So during this extended aging of about 15 years for the 2002, the wines are tasted regularly by the winemaking team just to kind of monitor this evolution. The second plenitude of Dom Perignon is really just elevated to new heights, deeper, longer, more intense, while still maintaining that balance and harmony. So with this being said, 2002 was exceptional. The contrast leading up to harvest resulted in really great berry concentration of the fruit. There was an outstanding maturity of grapes. It was among the best vintages of the past several decades. Maturity of Chardonnay, again, was another hallmark of this vintage. Marzipan and sweet spices are really coming through, so you get a little bit more of kind of the secondary and tertiary characteristics in the wine. From that extended maturation time. Got that nice characteristic.
Yeah, certainly some bread dough, a little bit of a...
Yeah, yep, and exactly
some nuttiness.
Mm-hmm.
Still get some white pepper, maybe a little bit of apple. It's actually still drinking very, very young. I know a couple of years ago, we had the P2 from the 2000 vintage, and that one was actually much further along in its evolution, I thought. It had even more tertiary development. This one still seems like it has a lot of aging potential ahead of it, and that has a ways to go to get to that same stage as the 2000 P2 a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And it's also an interesting comparison when you have a P1 and a P2 side by side, and then you can compare them and the difference that the extended lees aging has versus the one that's been bottle aged since release.
Yeah, absolutely.
With that extended lees aging, you get more of those autolytic notes. So if you're a fan of the toasted brioche, nutty bread dough type qualities, then probably the P2s and P3s are definitely something that you might enjoy.
Absolutely, yeah. That extra time on the lees, which is 15 years for P2 2002, really brings out a lot of that autolytic character. So the nice toastiness, nuttiness really comes to the forefront. The fruit is still there, but it kind of becomes a little bit more muted. Those nice autolytic notes, as well as the salinity, just kind of envelops the fruit in a nice balance.
Excellent. Well, shall we move on to the 2006 rosé?
Let's do it. Sounds good. So,
and so all the wines that we're drinking today are actually the current releases, and so people could actually source these in the market currently. Is that correct?
Yes. So these are all three of these cuvées are available in the market right now. We're going to be launching 2 new vintages towards the end of this year, so I'm excited for that. Stay tuned. In terms of Dom Perignon Rosé 2006, the creation of this wine really integrates a new third element into the blend, which is the red wine from still Pinot Noir. So this is especially challenging considering the cold, humid climate in Champagne. Only a really bold, assertive blend can marry the power of red still Pinot Noir while still kind of allowing that harmony and sophistication of Dom Perignon. So they're really committed to bringing out that thrilling red character of the Pinot Noir. And this is always challenging. You're kind of playing with the paradox without contradicting. You still, no matter what, want to achieve harmony. So with Dom Perignon Rosé, requires a slow transformation of about 10 to 12 years, extended lees aging, depending on the vintage. But for 2006, it was 10 years. Really, this long maturation in the cellars protects the red character of the Pinot Noir until it fully expresses itself in a bold, profound, harmonious way. The 2006 vintage was a generally warm one. It was rather dry, a lot of contrasts again, a hot July, colder, damp August, I think a pretty hot September. But for the most part, there was a great roundness and generosity of this vintage that you see across the board. It's interesting that happened in 2006. We started working with a new red wine facility. This was really just an investment to find the best way to extract the phenolics of Pinot Noir. And this resulted in really much higher expression of the wine. And so with the 2006 rosé, this is a really big wine. There's 23% still red wine in this blend, which is relatively high for Champagne. Typically, you'll see on rosés, I'd say on average about 15% still red wine used in the blend, and there's 23% in here. But Dom Perignon tends to go higher with the still Pinot Noir in their blends. Not uncommon to see, upwards of 23, 24, 25% still red wine in their rosé. So for the taste profile, what this does, it's a powerful wine. That red profile is there, but it's accompanied by that balance, great roundness with, again, great structure. The nose, really great dark spices, cocoa, there's like roasted fig, apricot, candied orange.
You're still getting the autolytics as well. The brioche and the toasted nuts.
Yes, absolutely.
But there's also a minerality, a little bit of maybe like a chalkiness. The gunflint quality, I can see hints of it. It's not as prominent as it probably will be with age, but I can see that it's already kind of there a little bit, and there's hints of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're just talking about the descriptors still for the 06 rosé, and I was mentioning the autolytic qualities that are still there. You mentioned the fruit profile, so certainly there's some raspberry there. Also some chalkiness and some minerality, and then hints of the gunflint that will probably become more prominent as it ages.
Yes, absolutely.
But the interesting thing, as you mentioned, was the high percentage of the still rosé, and that also gives you some interesting food pairings. We've had some dinners in the past where the rosé has actually been paired with red meat, and it was a very, very successful pairing given the the actual power and concentration of this wine and the high level of the still rosé that's in it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not going to compete with a lot of flavors in the food that you're having. It's really just going to kind of make you salivate, whet your appetite. When you have the addition of still red wine, when it comes to rosé champagne, you're adding this other element to an already very food-friendly wine that really, allows it to stand up to even more pairings. You can pair with red meat. You can do more traditional champagne pairings, lighter fare, but yeah, I would say, go ahead with, prosciutto, lambs, bigger, bolder flavors. The wine, you're not going to lose any bit of the wine. It's going to stand up to those flavors with the backbone of that acidity and pair really beautifully.
And then certainly with age, still Pinot becomes more pronounced as well. We've had some older vintages of the Dom Rosé, and if you would blind them, you would get a lot of almost the Burgundian character on the nose. That still Pinot becomes even more pronounced with time, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what's ahead in terms of some of the upcoming offerings that Dom may have.
Sure. So right now we just tasted through our current vintages on the market. So the Dom Perignon Vintage 2010, our Dom Perignon P2 2002, and the Dom Perignon Rosé 2006. And so later on in the second half of this year, we're very excited. We're going to be launching two new vintages, the Dom Perignon Vintage 2012 and the Dom Perignon P2 2003. You'll see a little bit more about this launch later in the year, but probably coming in the second half of the year, depending on where you live. Something else as well, we've done several artistic collaborations in the past with Michael Riedel, Jeff Kuntz, Lenny Kravitz, to name a few. And this will continue this year as well. We have another very exciting collaboration in the works, so stay tuned for that.
Yeah, one of my favorites was the Andy Warhol collaboration. I still have some of those bottles, and those are really, really cool as well.
Yeah, they're so fun. They're fun to collect.
We have a couple questions. One question was with respect to vintages in which you do not declare a Dom. What happens to the fruit?
So that they don't really share with us. We have lots of different partnerships throughout Moet Hennessy and with our growers in the region. It's kind of a secret. Yeah, you never really know. It's just that's kind of all happens behind the scenes. But
what can you tell us about the chef de cave for Dom Perignon?
Our newest chef de cave, Vincent Chaperon, he's outstanding. So he spent 13 years alongside his predecessor, Richard Dupois, who retired in 2019. Vincent Chaperon, he actually first started working with Dom Perignon in the 2006 vintage, so we got to see this with the 2006 Rosé.
And what are some of your favorite all-time vintages of Dom Perignon?
Probably my pinnacle champagne, the best that I've ever consumed, has to be a bottle of Dom Perignon P3 1971. I shouldn't say bottle because I did not get to have the bottle. I had a small taste at a wine dinner a few years ago. You were there, John. This truly I had never tasted anything like this before. It was just had all these beautiful characteristics of like coffee and cocoa, things that you wouldn't expect from a champagne. It was incredible. So cool. The coolest thing I've ever tasted. Yeah, the P3s, they're incredibly rare, but it's really just the pinnacle of aged champagne. It's just expressive in a way that tastes evolved and not old. There's nothing about the wine, even though it was, a 1971 vintage, there was nothing about the wine that tasted old. It was just mature and evolved, and it was beautiful.
I agree. The good thing about the P3s is that you have less bottle variation because they came straight from the winery, whereas with some of the P1s that you get with extended bottle age, some are otherworldly, but some could be, if they weren't stored properly, they could have oxidative problems or other flaws that were caused after they were released into the secondary market. And so there you'll have more variation. So the P3 is a great opportunity for people who want to try the aged wines without having that potential risk of getting a bad bottle.
Absolutely.
But then certainly going back, if you look at the top vintages for me, I would think certainly 76 is way up there. That's probably been responsible for 3 of my top 5 all-time champagne experiences.
Which year? Sorry, what did you say?
1976.
Oh, 76.
1976.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. And so I've had 2 of the P1s that were up there, and then 1 of the 76 enotecs. So that was from the old enotec program. I've had some others where the storage probably wasn't quite as good, but when it's on, that one is definitely one of my favorites, along with the P3 you mentioned. And then going into the 80s, certainly 82 and 85 and 88. Are all very, very good. I've enjoyed both of those 3 vintages very much.
Yeah, I had a chance to try a little bit of the 85 and the 88 a couple of years ago at a dinner. I mean, it's amazing just how different they are too. Those were two different vintages, but we actually, they were expressing themselves kind of opposite than what you'd expect. The 88 was a little bit more generous, round, voluptuous. 85 held a little bit more of a linear acidity to it. But those are great vintages. In fact, those are right now, I think current P3 is 1990. But you still, out in the secondary market, at some restaurants with larger wine lists, you might be able to find some 1988 and 85 out there. But those are, beautiful, beautiful wines.
And the difference between 88 and 90 is quite interesting as well, because for a long time I really enjoyed the 90s, and I still think it's very, very outstanding and drinking well. But there's a big difference between 88 and 90, where 90 has more of the caramel and the richness, where 88 has a really intriguing acidity that's very, very precise and a little bit more the minerality. So very different styles, but both drinking extremely well right now as well. And then certainly if people are interested in getting some back vintages, 96 and 2002 are certainly going to be probably the most collectible, along with the 2008. So if you can't find the 96 and the 2002 in the market, then definitely seek out the 2008, because that's going to be definitely one for extended aging as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us. And every single time that you drink Dom Perignon, it becomes a special occasion. So you don't need to save it for a special occasion. Even if you have it just a weekday, it just elevates the day and definitely creates its own memories. So I would definitely encourage everyone to buy more and to open it whenever you can, because it's really, really a special experience and a special wine. And I hope that everyone else will enjoy it as much as I do.
Absolutely. 100% agreed.
Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you soon. Cheers.